Hello, everyone. You don't need to record this yet. This is a warm-up.
It's recording.
Oh my gosh. I went with my daughter to the zoo the other day, and we saw a magnetic cage. And I asked the zookeeper what's going on. He said it was bred in captivity. So, yep. That was my best one, huh? Ooh, tough crowd, huh? Good afternoon to everyone here, and I'd like to introduce myself. I'm Jonathan Straube. I am the IT manager for NREL in the UVB program. Most of you might know me just as the computer guy, right? But I've been so inspired by some of the people in this very room here that I also did get a master's degree in ecology. But enough about me. In this very room here, we have former ESA presidents, presidential rank award winner, and she was supposed to be here. Our National Academy of Science member was supposed to be here too, but Diana skipped out on us to do her own thing. Dennis was supposed to be here, my IPCC member here. So you're making my speech here not so good, but Aldo Leopold winners and etc. You have a very fantastic group of people here. So how do you get a group of people like that, of that caliber here on a Wednesday afternoon for a seminar, right? You know them before they win the awards and have the fellowships, right? I first met Nicole 20-ish years ago. These days it's impolite to say 20 plus. So back in those days, we were required to attend seminars like this. Staff, students, faculty, we all attended these seminars. And we also went out and we also did field work together. And we went hiking and we hung out, right? And we'd have parties in Old Town. That was back in the days when grad students could afford to live in Old Town, right? And everybody brought something to the party, right? Someone brought beer, someone brought food, someone had the house, but somebody would also bring the music. And back in those days, Nicole, she had an iPod. Now, many of you don't know what iPod is, but back then it was a marvel of things. It had like 1,000 songs on it, right? Yeah. And unfortunately, Nicole would mostly play ABBA. But, and I was just thinking how appropriate that was. Anyone who has spent any time with Nicole immediately feels her positive bounding energy and drive, and of course her ability to conduct things, because she had the iPod, so she was always like controlling all the music. And she took that drive and she studied under Diana Wall soils in the dry Antarctic Valley and took that knowledge with her to Oregon. But not only did she take her knowledge, she took the relationships that she had built up here and at other institutions. While she was in Oregon, she got a position with the USGS and worked her way up there and pursued a PhD in soil science, really? Yeah. Okay. At Oregon State University, right? And through the USGS, she worked her way into the director of the Climate Adaptation Science Center. Am I saying it right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Northwest.
In the Northwest. And also for the North Central Climate Science Center. And then hopefully she'll just be director of one. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Okay. And I'm sure that she will tell you that her education here at CSU and Oregon State were very valuable to her job. But equally important are the relationships that she established during her academic career. Ecosystem science is a big field of study, and no particular person can possibly know all of the statistics, processes that you will need to understand and fully comprehend it. In fact, many of the people you're sitting right next to are going to be the next Aldo Leopold Fellows, right? The next National Academy of Science winners. Build your relationships here, because you will rely on those people for your science in the future. Let's see. It's big science, but you're soon going to find it's a very small world with the people that you work with. Okay? From music director to science director, I would like to introduce a very good friend of mine, director Nicole DeCrappeo.
That was the nicest, longest. You took like half of my talk time. But what a lovely introduction. Thank you so much, Jonathan. It has been so fun to be here the last couple of days. And yes, everything you just said, like literally was part of my talk, but the seeds you plant, I've come to realize this now more than ever, that the seed, you don't even realize a lot of times that you're planting seeds along the way, but you're planting seeds now for 20 years down the road. And I can say, that my time at Colorado State was so formative. It was so incredibly special. And Jonathan is right. I used to sit in these seminars. I was in the audience, and so I've been reflecting this week a lot on that person I was sitting in the audience 20 years ago, and the things I thought about at that time, and how my own sort of progression has followed along kind of with this climate adaptation science and practice. So I'm sort of going to weave together my personal story a little bit with the work here that I'll describe to you. But I work with so many people from CSU still to this day who are the leaders in the climate science world, climate adaptation world, and beyond. So so look at that person next to you and make sure you keep in touch, because you will definitely draw on them later. Oh, I have to explain the unicorn. It'll come into play at some point. But this is what we're talking about, climate adaptation science and practice. It's a lot of like very special unicorn projects that I'm talking about here, and like different types of different approach to doing the science that it's difficult to marry these things well. And when we find them, and we find projects and initiatives that are advancing both adaptation science and practice at the same time, that's what I refer to as our sort of magical unicorn projects. And so I'll just sort of refer back to the unicorns as we go through here. So this is the general, it's not going to be like a linear journey here that I'm going to take you on, but this is kind of what I'm going to talk about. I'll weave some of these things together, but I did want to tell you a little bit about my personal journey, just because, like I said, this has been fun for me to reflect on my time at CSU and come here in a different role and a different stage of my life. So I'm going to tell you a little bit how I got here. I also appreciated when I was a student hearing other people's paths. I'm not your typical presenter, I don't think. I'm a federal scientist. Well, I used to be a scientist. I'm a federal science manager now. I don't do my own research anymore. I direct research. And so I was going to share some insights about what that's like as well, and kind of making that transition. Hopefully that's of interest to people. And then kind of get into the role of scientists and decision making. So that's, again, something that was really sort of debated when I was here 20 years ago, and it's really shifted quite a bit. And Jill, yeah, you're shaking your head, right? I'll talk a little bit about sort of institutional context. I will describe to you the Climate Adaptation Science Center network, which is it's the network I work in now. And so I just need to give you kind of a little institutional background there of what we do there and the business of science. And then we get into the what and the how. So what's climate adaptation? What is actionable science? What is participatory science? And I risk, this is almost so basic that I risk offending you. I don't know. In some cases, some people are like, of course, that's what that is. And in other cases, people have no idea what any of those phrases are. So I'm gonna go through what that means and what that looks like for us. And then, of course, I'll end with giving you a lot of examples of how we're doing this within the CASC network. So let's begin. So a little bit about my path. I grew up, it starts on the East Coast, moves west, a little jaunt in Antarctica, didn't fit well on my map, so it's not in the right place. But I grew up in State College, Pennsylvania. My family comes from Northeast Pennsylvania. My dad is Italian-American. I come from Italian immigrants on my dad's side and German-American and French-American immigrants on my mom's side. And we lived in a really nice college town. I enjoyed a lot of privilege that I didn't recognize until much later in life, growing up in State College, PA. Just for orientation, I am a white, cis, heterosexual female and have enjoyed a lot of privilege throughout my life. And you can see that, in my path. And I just want to make sure that that's really well acknowledged, that I've been the recipient of a lot of privilege in my life. I wanted to go, this is where I get to the sort of like the big, I went from big to small to big again. I wanted to go to college to either be a whale biologist or president of the United States. So I went to American University in Washington, DC for my undergrad, because that's where you go to be president, obviously. And when I was there, I was studying congressional, I think it was called legislative and congressional behavior. And I was like, this is super boring. I cannot study this. And they had just started an environmental studies program there. So I switched into environmental studies. And my undergrad advisor was a cave biologist. So I got to do a ton of caving, and I'd already done some caving in Pennsylvania, but so I did a lot of caving with him, and we studied these little creatures called Gammarus minus, which lived in caves and are typical cave creatures with elongated features and no pigment and small reduced eyes. And so that kind of spurred me to sort of start to appreciate the smaller things and the little critters. And then I moved to Florida, and I did an AmeriCorps position, actually, where I was describing new species of nematodes. John, some nematodes, like, you ever see nematodes in talks anymore, John? So I was describing these new species of nematodes, and that's what led me here to CSU. So I worked with Diana Wall on my master's degree, studying entomopathogenic nematodes in tallgrass prairie systems, so out the Kansa Prairie. And if you're not familiar with entomopathogenic nematodes, these are nematodes that are able to attack an insect either by ambushing them or pass as an insect is passing by, they'll sort of crawl inside the insect's body, and then they start to they kill and eat the guts of this insect, and they reproduce. They go through a whole life cycle, and they also have this symbiotic bacteria that creates a favorable environment for the nematodes live in, keeps the integrity of the insect in place in the soil, so it doesn't just decompose before the life cycle of the nematodes is finished. I can't believe I can remember this because this is literally like 20 years ago. It's the first time I've ever talked about this, but they're so cool. It looks like spaghetti. It's disgusting. And they all then after the life cycle is over, they all emerge into the soil and it all starts again. So that was my, the master's thesis. And we were really looking at ecosystem functioning and biodiversity in tallgrass prairie. And this was my piece of that. Then I got to go to Antarctica for a season with Diana and her crew, and that was amazing and just really, really, one of the highlights of my life, honestly. And then I made my way out to Oregon, and I started to work. I got a job with the US Geological Survey, and I was situated in Corvallis, so at Oregon State University, and I then was able to do my PhD as part of that, my gig out there. And my PhD was on soil community dynamics and sagebrush and cheatgrass invaded areas of the Northern Great Basin. So I was looking at soil communities and how they had changed with cheatgrass invasion, which is a huge, you all are, I assume, familiar with cheatgrass invasion into the sagebrush steppe. So that was my PhD work. And I'm not going to go into my PhD work with you, but I'm showing you a little bit of information to make my point about kind of the way we thought about applied science back when I was doing my PhD. So sure, I had some broad conclusions from my PhD work. The conversion of sagebrush shrublands to cheatgrass grasslands resulted in major changes to the soil community structure. And I was particularly interested in looking at the effects of that on nitrogen cycling in these areas. And it was a little bit different in the Great Basin than it had been found to be in other ecosystems. But we also found a lot of evidence that fungi, soil fungi in particular, were important for sustaining this kind of conservative nitrogen cycle in these sagebrush soils. And then I have this slide, which says implications for restoration, right? And it said, reference data of native and cheatgrass invaded soil communities can be incorporated into assessments of site degradation and restoration success. And the goal was to shorten restoration trajectories by manipulating soil communities. And that was the end. And I published my dissertation, and I thought for sure that soil restoration in the Great Basin would be furthered by my dissertation work, right? And that was the end of my sort of outreach or any kind of continued work on this with, in the sense of applying that to any kind of real world problem. And so fast forward a little bit, a few years, I joined the CASC network. So this is the Climate Adaptation Science Center network. And let me tell you a little bit about this. Is now we're getting into the kind of institutional context of the work I do now. So we are also now getting back to the big. I went from the big whales and President of the United States to the small nematodes, soil microbial communities. Now I'm getting back big into climate work. And this was a big jump for me to be sort of thrown into a whole different world, right? I was very much a soil scientist, soil community scientist, and didn't necessarily like to work with people very much either. And I know, weird, yeah. But I didn't. That's why I studied soils. And so I started to work on climate adaptation, climate science. At that time, we weren't quite yet into the adaptation phase of things. And it started to really broaden a lot of my perspectives in a lot of different ways. So our mission in the CASC network is to deliver science to help fish, wildlife, water, land, and people adapt to a changing climate. We have 9 regional centers. You can see them broken out here. And we also have a national center back in the Washington, D.C. area. I am the director for the Northwest Center. And until about a month ago, I also directed the North Central Center, the North Central CASC, which includes Colorado. And we also have, as part of this network, it's a federal university partnership. So the federal side, these are Department of the Interior entities. So I am a USGS employee, that's the USGS Bureau, where we just run through. And then there's a university host and consortium for each region. So in the, I think I have maps of, yeah. So in the North Central region, the host currently is CU Boulder. And you can see the states that the North Central encompasses and the consortium partners that we've got in this region. And then for the Northwest, the University of Washington is our host, and again, the consortium of partners. I also want to point out, we also have a very close tribal partnership that's part of all of this relationship. We work with the Bureau of Indian Affairs, who fund tribal liaisons that are situated in our CASC regions, and they are absolutely instrumental in helping us to identify the needs, the climate adaptation needs for the tribal communities that we work with, and helping us to support those. So I am going to focus more on the Northwest because I've been with that center much longer. But I will give a few North Central sort of focused examples for this work as well. So in our early years, we were actually just called Climate Science Centers. We didn't add the name adaptation until a few years ago. And we were really focused on, climate downscaling and uncertainty analysis to begin with. And then we kind of, at the same time doing hydrologic modeling. We started to move a little bit more into understanding biological impacts of climate change on all sorts of ecosystems and species and disturbance regimes. And then in the later years and to now, we are really firmly sort of planted in this climate adaptation space. But here's where we get into a little bit more of the meat of this. Well, what is climate adaptation? What is climate adaptation science, and what is climate adaptation practice? To put it sort of simply, right, it's the science and practice of decreasing vulnerability and or increasing resilience to climate change. But what does that entail, right? I mean, there's a lot of stuff that has to go into doing climate adaptation on the ground. Not just these three sort of boxes that I already showed you, right? There's a lot of climate modeling and downscaling that goes into that, and hydrologic modeling and biological impacts assessments and vulnerability assessments, et cetera, et cetera. But then you also have to start, as soon as you start getting into all of that and realizing, oh, nobody's able to use all of this information, but we need to understand the institutional context. Oh, and now we need a social scientist because we don't understand how it is that people make decisions, and we don't understand how the role of emotions in these decisions, and we need to know the economic aspects of this. So there's a lot of social science that it's very obvious now to us, that needs to also be incorporated, as well as those institutional contexts. Then doing the stakeholder engagement is a skill and a science all on its own as well, right? And so now we're also including the stakeholder engagement, which I'll go into a lot more about that in just a minute here. And then you need to do communications, but it can't just be like a newsletter or whatever. I mean, you have to have a person that specializes in communications. It's not just a scientist who's sort of putting out this information, right? So there's a lot that goes into really effective and ethical climate adaptation. And so that's what we have been really focused on, how to do this holistically and bringing together teams of people who really can specialize, not just in climate modeling, but in very effective and ethical stakeholder engagement as well. Like I said, I hope this isn't just like the most basic, obvious stuff to you. You might be still saying, yeah, that's what I do all the time, Nicole. And I hope that that is true, but I'll just dig into it a little bit more with you here. The other thing that we are really, adamant about promoting in the work that we do is this notion of actionable science. So not just applied science, right, but actionable science. And again, actionable science, to give you some basic definitions, right? There are scientific outputs or findings that are useful, usable, and used just so, to support something specific, like a management plan, a decision, or an action. In other words, science that's used to inform decision-making and help solve real-world problems. So our approach to this, in the CASC network, we are like a mini funding agency. So we're able to fund a lot of this type of work. Our approach is to deliver actionable science by conducting research in close partnership with natural and cultural resource managers, by collaboratively identifying the problems, researching and analyzing, and disseminating and interpreting the information. So let me just go, again, a little bit more in depth into what this looks like, and want to make sure that we're all on the same page about this. So why do we think it's so important to have a different approach to this work and do the actionable science? If you're familiar with kind of this body of work around actionable science, right? The sort of default model is what's known as the deficit model, where it's a bit more of a one-way information transfer from a researcher who has this great idea to a decision maker, where you deliver a paper, sort of that loading dock analogy as well. And you're saying, I've done it. It's exactly what I did with my PhD. Done it, saved the world, move on. But how is it that the decision maker will find and access that journal article? They probably won't. If they do, will they have the expertise to understand it and apply it in their work? I mean, maybe. What if it doesn't fit their particular geography or resource? That's a problem. And then what if all those things happen to be true, but they don't have the authority or the funding to use the information? So these are all really pretty big barriers and blockages along the way of kind of using that science in any actual meaningful on the ground way. So we have really moved into the co-production model, which again, I'm assuming you all know this word and are very familiar with what this means. It is more two-way sharing of information where researchers and decision makers are coming up with ideas together, collaboratively. And now you're creating some new shared knowledge. And we refer to these as boundary objects, right? And so they can take a lot of different forms: webinars, websites, decision support tools, newsletters, communities of practice. I think this one is a phone app, something like that, right? So a lot of different types of information that's co-produced with the folks that will be using this on the ground. I'm going to throw one more sort of phrase at you: participatory science. So another step along this route, and we're really pretty now grounded in supporting participatory science. So what is that? That's really referring to this extensive, iterative, two-way communication and ongoing engagement between scientists and end users of the scientific output. Again, I'm going to go into a little bit more detail on this. This is all work that I'm taking from the acting director. She's the current acting director for the North Central CASC, Aparna Bamsai-Dodson, who's done an amazing amount of work on this, just finished her PhD. So I just want to show you this continuum of participation, or the way that you can engage stakeholders. And I just want to point out, there's no individual best approach to this, right? It's different situations and different topics call for different ways of engaging with stakeholders. But there is sort of a continuum or a circle that we're following here. So again, this inform is what we talked about first, sort of that one-way transfer of information, the loading dock approach, large-scale dissemination of information. And you move one step along the circle into the consult pie slice, where we have limited consultation, and then there's a little bit more back and forth in that phase, in that slice of pie, but still a little bit more where you'll have a project with an advisory committee that you might check in with once or twice a year on a particular project, and make sure you're generally going in the right direction. Next along the line is the participatory. So human, user-centered design, translational ecology, and boundary spanning. And I would say this is where our unicorn projects are. This is where we're trying to always sort of be, I should have put a unicorn there. You make me note. So this is where we're trying to live, in that really participatory science space. And then the final pie slice is to empower, where you really have the end users are co-equal in power in every aspect of the project, right? They're fully empowered along the way to make decisions about how the work will be engaged. I think I went over this well enough, so this is just kind of a repeat, giving some examples of that, so I'm going to go past that. I think one of the important things, so finally, maybe I'm to a point now you're saying, okay, yep, I'm still with you, I still do all of that. But I think one of the last things I want to really point out about this type of work is that you also then have to think about sort of the benefits and harms, or how to do this work ethically when you're talking about stakeholder engagement or participatory science. So I'm still pulling from Aparna Bamsai-Dodson's work here, but these are some of the Belmont principles that she has made sure we understand are super important for us to understand in the work that we do and our funding, right? So respect for persons, protecting the autonomy of all people and treating them with courtesy and respect, and allowing for informed consent. Researchers must be truthful and conduct no deception. Beneficence, the philosophy of do no harm while maximizing benefits for the research project and minimizing risks to the research subjects. There are a lot of times where we, especially in the federal government, have obviously not potentially respected tribal sovereignty, for example, where there have been data breaches, where there has been a lot of times where the research subjects and the people that we were engaging with were in fact harmed by the research that we've done. I'm not saying the CASC network, but over the years, lots of federal science has done this. And then justice, ensuring reasonable, non-exploitive, and well-considered procedures are administered fairly, the fair distribution of costs and benefits to potential research participants and equally. This also, we're also thinking a lot about in our network about environmental justice and climate justice and making sure that we're not going into communities and following all of this when we're going into communities that we've traditionally not worked with. Stakeholders in the projects, Aparna, again, this is part of her survey work. They really wanted to make sure that there were clear roles and responsibilities. And you can see this, and I want to point this out because I know that in a lot of proposals for our RFPs, you have to show this, right? You have to show that you're doing stakeholder engagement or what that broader implication of the work will be. And I just want to show you this quote here. So this one talks about, I'm not sure our researchers had a clear understanding of what we expected from them. We put stuff in the proposal, but none of that stuff was ever well thought out. And that was a horrible, horrible problem for us in terms of communications. And one more here, that stakeholders often feel that the consideration of their needs is sometimes a check the box exercise. So again, that comes through when there's not sort of a more meaningful, deep engagement where the end users are helping to lead the project. So let me get to a few actionable science examples to share with you to ground this a little bit more, give you some ideas of how we do this in the CASC network. One way we do it is actually from the very start with our overall science planning. So we have 5-year science plans that we use to, that we develop with an advisory committee. I'll show you the advisory committee in just a second. And that's used to develop our annual science plans to address their management priorities. So we then solicit proposals that align with that science plan and fund the projects that best address partner needs. One of the things about the science business, the business of doing science, that I thought was so interesting when I kind of moved over from research into science administration was how proposal selections are made, right? And you kind of think, right, that it's all based on the actual science and the methodologies. And, if your proposal is hitting all the marks, it really should get consideration, and you're very upset when it doesn't get considered for funding or gets rejected. Well, when I came over to the other side, I realized that there were a lot more considerations that went into proposal selection than just the science. In fact, a lot of times the science is the last part that gets considered. There's a lot to do with sort of balancing the portfolio or thinking about, what geography you need. We have to sort of balance how many projects we have in any particular area or any particular topic or with particular stakeholders or end users and things. So there's a lot of those kind of considerations that should be made explicit in the proposal criteria, but often aren't, right? And so that was just one of the things that I learned kind of early on and almost wished I could, go back to my past self and tipped me off on that. So to develop our 5-year science agenda, like I said, we have an advisory committee. This is for the Northwest CASC, the center I direct. So you can see a lot of different logos there. So we have federal partners, a lot of partners from the Department of the Interior, as well as other federal agencies. We work with state fish and game agencies, Idaho, Washington, and Oregon, and then a number of intertribal organizations that represent the 54 tribes across the Northwest. So they have a lot of input into the work that we do. And they're helping us to define the highest level management priorities that are in need of climate information. So I rely heavily on them. This is what our 5-year, looks pretty simple, looks like ridiculously simple, but there's a lot of work that goes into this. But for the last 5 years, we're in the process of updating it right now. But we start with the management priorities, and these are some of the highest level management priorities. So this is the management of aquatic resources in the face of climate change. That's what all of those sort of refer to. But from there, what we do is we derive then a couple of more specific management goals and then derive our key science opportunities or the research opportunities from there. So we've flipped the script a little bit in that we're starting first and foremost with those management priorities. This is the North Central's 5-year strategic science plan. I just wanted to show you for this region. It's formatted a little differently, shaped a little differently. They have it set up in terms of priority ecosystems, but then again, those management challenges here on the right, which have been derived or articulated to us by the advisory committee folks that we work with. So that's on the highest level, sort of our 5-year science agenda. So we're even trying to do that co-production, participatory science with our science agenda and how we decide the science priorities that we call for proposals on. Now I'm going to go into a couple of more sort of specific on the ground type projects that, again, have been led by, not by me, because I don't do the research anymore, but by folks that I work with in the CASC network. So this is Lindsay Thurman, who's with the Northwest CASC, and she has been working with a lot of people, and I'll tell you her partners in just a second, in applying assessments of adaptive capacity to inform conservation planning in a changing climate. So if you're familiar with vulnerability assessments, how to do a vulnerability assessment, it really consists of 3 different legs of the stool, so to speak. So we have an exposure piece, which is the rate and magnitude of climate change experienced. We have a sensitivity piece, which is a dose response, the susceptibility or degree of impact. And then the adaptive capacity of a species, right, which is their ability to cope or adjust to the changes that they're seeing. What we have pretty good information for a lot of species on exposure and sensitivity, but not very good information on adaptive capacity. So that's sort of the missing or wobbly leg of that stool. So that's a lot of the work that Lindsay has been doing in the Northwest. So they came up with this trait-based menu. I'm not going to go through it in a ton of detail, but she's working with her partners in the state fish and game agencies, as well as Fish and Wildlife Service and some of the tribes in the region, to look at these different traits of adaptive capacity for species of greatest conservation need, which have been identified by the states. So they're evaluating these potential adaptive capacity pathways, and 2 of the sort of main categorization there is that they either persist in place or they shift in space. So they're able to stay and adapt in place, or they move to a different place. So they evaluate their general adaptation approaches and then are selecting from this adaptive capacity informed adaptation menu, right? And so this is sort of an exercise that Lindsay can go through with her partners to very much, this part of it, I would say, was the research and discovery part that she was working on. As you know, she's a PhD scientist and she has done this work as part of her sort of science capacity, but she then also takes it around and works with the stakeholders to apply that work very directly. This is kind of a nice like little array of the mammals and birds and amphibians and reptile species that she has worked on with the state partners. And particularly see the groups at the bottom there. For the Forest Service as well as another group that we work with quite a bit. And then this has been now incorporated into a couple of different applications. So this voluntary guidance for states to incorporate climate change into their state wildlife action plans and other management plans, which is a big deal. This is those are known as SWAPs, the state wildlife action plans. All of the states have to have a SWAP in order to receive money from the Fish and Wildlife Service to do their work. And so they are all very interested in using this in their SWAP updates. She's also been a part of the National Fish, Wildlife, and Plants Climate Adaptation Strategy. That's an update that's in progress right now. And then again, sort of a gray literature, but linking adaptive capacity to species status assessments. So that's another Fish and Wildlife Service phrase. What am I trying to say? That's their species status assessments for assessing whether or not species will be potentially listed as threatened or endangered. So her work is really being applied on the ground and in a lot of these plans, and it's super exciting. And she gets sort of a lot of calls, right, to help them with this for different partners to help with this kind of work. This is changing gears now a little bit. This is work that Brian Miller, who's a research ecologist with the North Central CASC, he has been working really closely with the National Park Service in doing a lot of scenario planning. So there's a group here in Corvallis, or I live in Corvallis, you live in Fort Collins. There's a group here in Fort Collins that you might not be aware of, but they're in Southtown. It's the National Park Service Climate Change Response Program, and they are fantastic, some really, really excellent people there. And we work with them quite a bit, Brian Miller in particular. So they do a lot of scenario planning with the Park Service. So on these different individual park units, they're looking to do, develop these frameworks to support decisions under certain and uncontrollable conditions. And they offer these range of scenarios of plausible futures, right? They're not predictions, but they're these different plausible futures that they're presenting to the parks, to these individual park units. So some of the just kind of high level outcomes of this, they have some management outcomes. So they have some park level management plans and actions. So these are two examples of those. They're called, in the Park Service, they refer to these as resource stewardship strategy summaries. So this is for Devil's Tower National Monument. This one's for Wind Cave National Park. So that is, this is one of the many outputs of this. They also have developed national guidance. So again, a resource stewardship strategy, this development guide, and this integration of climate change scenario planning into their resource stewardship strategy process. So this has now become part of a standardized planning process for the National Park Service. And then there's also the scientific outcomes. So I think a lot of scientists worry that when they do this kind of work, your publication record, it could suffer a little, right? You might not publish quite as fast. That could be the worry. That could be something that you have to think about in terms of your career and your career advancement. But what I would say is that I have seen the scientists in our network actually really thrive and publish the same number, or if not more, because there are also these really interesting different types of publications that they're able to get out of them that are science publications, not just gray literature, but it has a different sort of audience, right? And so two different papers that Brian has been a co-author on: Conservation Under Uncertainty, Innovations in Participatory Climate Change Scenario Planning from US National Parks, and then this one that he's a co-author on, Overcoming Analysis Paralysis Through Better Scenario Planning. So the folks in our network, and there's another one here in the room, Mitch here in the front can speak to this as well. We have a lot of folks who are really successful in the network in doing this. And as a USGS scientist, they have to be able to publish. This is still part of their job in order to advance in the USGS. I'm going to give you a couple more quick examples of the type of work we do, not quite go as in depth in these, but just to give you another sense, some of our projects are quite localized, and then we also have a lot of work that we do that's sort of region-wide. This is one that's an example, one that's a little bit more localized, looking at current and future potential ecosystem services of the Nisqually River Delta. I point this one out because this is working really closely with one of the tribes in the Northwest, the Nisqually Indian tribe, and they're looking at that economic benefits of tribal Chinook salmon fishing and estimating climate change impacts on that. They're also looking at assessing trade-offs in ecosystem services under different management and sea level rise scenarios. So very much working very closely with the tribes on that. We also do a lot of work on what we refer to as refugia, all the different sort of flavors of refugia: climate refugia, drought refugia, fire refugia, cold water refugia. So this is one where we're putting together a map, an atlas, collection of maps on climate refugia and resilience for our whole Northwest region. So we'll have map locations of potential climate refugia for wildlife species in Oregon, Washington, Idaho, synthesizing a lot of existing data sets and information on species and habitats, and then producing this digital atlas of climate refugia for the species of concern. And this is something that we get a lot of requests for and have been working quite a bit with partners at the University of Washington and also the US Forest Service on, and Oregon State University. Now I'm going to give you a couple of examples of, again, not just the projects themselves, but how we try to also develop and foster communities of practice. And this is one example. So as I mentioned earlier, the CASCs are federal university partnerships. So this is part of the Northwest CASC's portfolio of work, but it's more led by the University of Washington side. But they lead what they call deep dives. And these deep dives are really, it's a deep dive into an emerging climate risk, a topic that, we haven't really explored yet, but that we're kind of sensing, can see on the horizon. We've done a few of these now, one on fire and ecological transformation, we've done one on West Side Fire for the Western Washington and Oregon. This particular one was on stream permanence and responding to climate-induced impacts on stream permanence in Northwest US. So this is a process, right? So this is a whole many months long process where we have both scientists and managers and decision makers. And of course, we started these right before the pandemic. So there was one of them that was in person, but the rest have all been Zoom oriented. So it's a number of Zoom meetings where we bring all these folks together. There's some shared learning together, and then they break into groups, and then we develop a lot of different sort of tools and findings and summary reports and resources for folks. And they also create an actionable science agenda around this topic that then they can sort of give to me, and we can help fund some of those projects where they find that there are funding gaps. So this has been really, really successful. It's been a really nice way to, like I said, develop a community of practice, to connect those scientists and managers in a really real and engaged and meaningful way. So those are the deep dives. We also have what we call the Regional Invasive Species and Climate Change Networks, risk networks across, not all of the regions have one yet, but we do have one here in the North Central region, and we do have one in the Northwest region. So these are, and there's one in the Northeast region, which is where actually it started. And these are, again, another community of practice around looking at that intersection between invasive species and climate change. It's sharing on the latest science around this. It's sharing on what science we may need, sharing on best practices. All of that is part of what the risk network is about. We put together management briefs, sort of synthesizing, again, the latest science. We put together webinars and symposia, and these have been really successful. We had a symposium in the Northwest now, well, it's about 1.5 years already, but we had something like 500 people register for that. So it's gotten a lot of traction and had been quite in demand for these to grow across our network. Then I want to also talk about some of the frameworks that we're thinking about in terms of climate adaptation. Again, this is it's still a new science, right? We're sort of figuring out what it is to do climate adaptation and practice on the ground. A group of mostly federal managers and scientists a few years ago were meeting and came up with the Resist, Accept, Direct framework, the RAD framework, which maybe some of you have heard about at this point. And this is not totally new. I don't want to say that this is the be-all, end-all framework that we all use. There are different frameworks that have touched on this or have used different words to describe this. But it's this idea that we're making decisions, even if we're pretending not to make decisions about the ecosystems that we are managing. And then the far current corner, we have the resist part of the framework, right? Which is to say, some changes can be resisted. Managers will work to maintain ecosystem processes, function, and composition without experiencing dramatic threshold crossing changes. So this is where I think, right, we have mostly lived in the resist. People want to keep what they have on the landscape. That's important to them. I want to see that tree right there until I die. This is what the ecosystem should look like, and we will do everything it takes to keep that here, right? So that's sort of the resist. And there's a lot of values and there's a lot of emotion, like I said, that plays into a lot of these decisions, but that's the resist. Accept. Many changes can be accepted, perhaps because they cannot feasibly be resisted or because they are acceptable to or even desirable by society. Managers will work to ease the transition. So this is where we've come to the conclusion that either it's maybe economically not feasible to maintain that ecosystem or a species, particular species, or as it says there, maybe even desirable to sort of let that transition happen. And we've accepted that and making again, a lot of value-based decisions here in terms of when that decision gets made. And then we have direct, which is still fairly new and something that we're trying to understand how to test the direct part of this framework. So with the direct, a few changes can be directed toward a different state, either because resistance is unrealistic or there's an opportunity to direct the change to a more desirable future state. Managers will face a new frontier in overseeing this process. So, this is really pretty radical. And the idea that we're not only going to accept that that change is happening and is maybe inevitable, but we're going to help it along, right? By maybe moving species around, by maybe genetically enhancing species, by doing conservation introductions, again, moving species around, basically. This is all fairly new and a little bit scary for people, and potentially there could be some unintended consequences. But in the face of climate change at the pace that we're moving, this is where a lot of managers feel like they need to go. And this is where I feel like in terms of us, the CASC network, where we're going, is trying to help in the direct space and how to figure out how to test that and understand what it means to have successful climate adaptation. We don't really know how to measure that at this point, right? How do you measure what's been successful from a climate adaptation standpoint? We can't really measure that for a few years. And by then, everything will have changed anyway, and our societal values will have changed. So that's a question we're really struggling with right now is how to test this and how to measure its success. I think this is my last slide, actually. So I just wanted to say that in this business of science and climate adaptation, one of the things, or our next steps, is to develop what we're sort of calling, but trying not to call, climate services or climate extension. We're trying, the word extension has a lot of weight to it for certain people, so we're trying to be careful as to what we use there. But basically, it's the development of climate adaptation tools and support. And what that looks like here, sort of, I just sketched this out, but it has to do with sort of the different levels of capacity that we are trying to build within our own network and with the partners that we serve. So I spoke earlier about sort of the need for the research scientists. We still obviously have to have that end of the spectrum, the discovery phase, the sort of very longer term, months to years sort of level of scientists kind of directing a lot of the work that we do. But then we also are building up this capacity with climate adaptation scientists. And that's what I described when I mentioned Lindsay Thurman and her adaptive capacity work. That's sort of where she falls in. She's got a PhD. She also publishes papers. She's doing research, but she's also spending more time. It's more of a time investment with the partners. And you might be working with them from maybe weeks to months, maybe it's years, but it can be a little bit shorter time frame, but you're still really engaging with the partners and engaging with the science quite a bit. And then maybe on the far end of the spectrum, we're also thinking about and starting to build in climate adaptation technical services, which could be someone you call up and you say, I need a map for this region of how this species is going to move, where they're going to move to in 20 to 50 years. And so maybe that's an hours to weeks kind of thing, right? They can pull that up in a few hours, or in a few weeks, they're able to get you kind of the information that you need. But we see this as really teams of people that are working together. And again, keeping in mind that not all of these people are going to be necessarily climate scientists or biologists or hydrologic modelers, like some of them could be social scientists, some could be better at stakeholder engagement, right? So there's all of that, those different kinds of knowing and knowledges that we want to make sure that we're embedding in these teams as well. But that's what we're thinking about sort of holistically in advancing this work. It takes, like I said, it takes a lot to do these, to do this kind of work on the ground, do it well, and not just hand people a paper and say, here it is, you're good to go. So I think that's my last slide, and I'm very happy. Thank you so much again. I'm very happy to take questions. Oh, yeah. Go ahead.
Thank you for your presentation. I really appreciate a lot of what you shared and how you shared it too. But I was thinking about this approach of actionable, usable science and how very little has changed even from the model you had for your PhD. So I'm just wondering what thoughts or strategies you might have to offer for academia when those are what's required in graduate portfolios, and also for our metrics as faculty in terms of what's valued for outputs.
Yeah, so I was asked to repeat for people on the Zoom who might not have been able to hear the question. So the question generally was, not a lot has changed over the years in terms of being able to do this kind of actionable science work. And especially in academia, it's not necessarily rewarded in the way that, right, maybe it is in other spaces. And what can we do to encourage and change that and those metrics in academia? Such a good question. We talk about this a lot. I mean, I think number one is funding sources, right? So as more and more funders get into this kind of work or understand the importance of funding that kind of work, right, then there'll be funding opportunities for students and faculty to apply for. And then, you know, yes, that will feed into a metric that's already used by the university, right, to understand or to value your work. Now, in terms of, you know, thinking about how you can encourage the change of those types of metrics, we've had those conversations quite a bit within the USGS, and actually Jill is here; she can speak to that. Mitch can speak to that, and those have been difficult conversations at times because, you know, publications, it's still the currency that people use. But I think we've done a really good job of helping people to understand that, you know, the extension part of it is incredibly important in terms of effectiveness on the ground. We have a lot of, you know, because we do work with a lot of Department of the Interior partners or other partners, they can also speak to that to Congress or to the different administrations. And so maybe we have a little bit more of that also helping us, where they can, when others can speak to the value of your work, that is helpful as well. But I think it just takes, I'm not sure, you know, I'm not calling it a problem, but that challenge in academia is a big one to overcome, right? Because it's a business. It's a business, and everybody is, you know, trying to maintain the model, the funding model. So sorry, I don't have really good answers for you. Anybody else chime in on that? Jill, feel free. But I think it's more funders are, like I said, able to show the value of this work that it'll change. It's been changing, I think, a lot already. And we have a lot of amazing, we also, I didn't mention this, but as part of the hosting agreement for the Northwest CASC, we have a fellows program. So we are also in training graduate students to do actionable science. So it's a course, they specifically take a course on how to do actionable science at the university. It's an addition, and then go through a number of other activities as a cohort. And that's totally separate from and in addition to their, you know, their funded research that they do, you know, with their major advisor. But that's been tremendously successful as well. And we've had a lot of folks now, not a lot, but they're starting to now become the folks that are applying to our jobs and are embedded in different organizations. And so slowly we're kind of building up that expertise. Yeah.
I just want to add, maybe it's a question more than anything, but a land grant university such as Oregon State or Colorado State, you know, they're in the business of application of science, not just, I'll invoke University of Colorado, where they're turning out scientists who don't necessarily have to apply their results. It seems like it should be easier at universities like ours to give credit for the application, not just the publication.
Yeah, that's right. I know it does. It does seem like that way. Yeah. Cool.
I had like 50 questions.
Yeah.
I'm gonna go with the one that kind of links in with this conversation. Is that I think one of the challenges. So I work at a service unit here, and I think one of the challenges is that application piece is a skill set.
Yeah.
As in and of itself.
It
I
is.
think that academics frequently, a lot of us are applied, especially here at CSU. But that skill set of applying and working with partners to get something done on the ground is something that we don't get in our regular graduate education. You get that when you get out.
Absolutely.
So,
Yeah.
can I ask another question?
Yeah. So I'll just repeat for people in the Zoom. She was talking about how that, the application of knowledge is not a skill set that you learn in graduate school or beyond.
Yes, but if you are here at CSU, look for the service centers that do that.
Okay.
We have lots of different groups that are very applied.
Yeah.
And so I want to just, I have 50 questions, but one is kind of simple. You talked about the direct portion of the RAD framework as being really radical, but can a lot of the things that we do, I think the example that I think of is looking at knowing that stopover habitat for migrating shorebirds is the biggest vulnerability that they have for climate change. Isn't like looking forward and making sure that we have suitable habitat in areas where the climate is projected to be okay, like just conservation, the way we do conservation.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, it doesn't always have to be super radical. You're right. Yeah, that's right.
I'm sure that fit in that box.
Yeah, I should say, right, we've done a lot of looking at, corridors and habitat fragmentation. And then in the past, right, you were looking at like what would make a good corridor today, but now we're looking at what would make a good corridor 20 years from now and trying to make sure that we can, potentially buy that land or in some way get some sort of, easement for so yes, exactly. It doesn't all have to be super, super radical. Yeah. Yeah. Stacy, yeah.
I'd like to build off of that, so.
Yeah, good.
But in addition to that, I think there's a lot to be learned from managed ecosystems in that arena. So for instance, in agriculture and changing species that are being cultivated in different areas because of climate shifts. So there's some potential for from those.
Yeah, that's a great point. That's a great point. Yeah. For people on the Zoom, learning from managed systems. Yeah. I'm so sorry. I cannot believe I talked so long. Like, I didn't think I would even have enough for half an hour, but well, you took up half my time. Yeah. That's I'm just kidding. Go ahead.
Well, I have, 50 or 60.
Wow.
And I also run a service center here on campus with the Southern Rockies Fire Science.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
The Joint Fire Science Program.
Very familiar. Yeah.
And two things. One is that to address Dominique's question is that there is some federal funders, when they put together calls for requests for proposals, require a portion of outreach for the research to go to managers and stuff, and that is required.
Right.
But we have a long way to go.
Yeah.
We have a long way to go.
Yeah, right. Exactly.
Does it show? No. The other one is you mentioned your funding, that you help your mini funding agency. Do you fund? You shared with us outcomes or outputs of the plans, the systems, the frameworks that are to go to these agency planning.
Yeah.
Do you fund just research and plans to do that, or do you also fund outreach events or tools or models or webinars or blah, blah, blah?
Yes, we do. All of those as well. We do, like workshops and, model. We do a little bit less model development, some trainings. We have to be careful with some of that. Our USGS, we have very specific, sorry, this is weedy, but we have very specific authority to do cooperative agreements, and it has to be for research and data collection. But we know how to get training out of that, capacity building, and, is what we call it, capacity building, and we can do workshops and we can do tool development, absolutely, support, decision support tools, all of that. Now, the trick with our funding is that you have to be either USGS or a member of the consortium or working with a member of the consortium. So currently, CSU is not a member of the North Central Consortium, but that could change. You should talk to people about
You know a guy.
it. You know a guy? Yeah, there you go.
Where I got the.
Yeah, you have the old, you just gave me that one. Yeah, it was, so every 5 years, the centers are recompeted, and the first 5 years, CSU was the host,
Right.
yeah. And now it's at Seaboulder, so, yeah. Jill?
So this is a follow-up on that. So these climate adaptation science centers have now been around for 10 years?
Yeah, 10, 11, 12, some,
And
yeah.
you talked about the products that you're co-producing, and they're mainly reports and tools, but the real goal is some sort of protection or evidence that you're conserving, or, are you beginning to mount programs to say, well, is it working?
I know, I know, Jill. And so I've had this conversation with people a lot over the years. Like, what is our metric of success? Is it that we did successfully incorporate it into a plan or a tool, or that we made a difference to the species on the ground? And we haven't gotten that far yet. We haven't been able to do that. That's such a good question. We're starting to figure out, do better evaluation of the program itself and all of our different regional centers, but no, we haven't. So that's a really, really important part of it. Oh, maybe Mitch has. Have you done it?
In the southeast, which is where my post is, we do have a project where we're collecting information on past projects and evaluating their contribution towards managerial decision-making,
Yeah.
or academic understanding. So
Yeah.
more like a comparison of sort of indirect impact versus direct impact. So
Right.
this evaluation component is becoming a bit more.
Yeah. But we still haven't made that jump to like a particular resource or ecosystem, right? Even in the Southeast, you're not saying like, yes, because of the things that we funded in the Southeast, that particular bird species is thriving. We're not like quite at that level. And that's what you're talking about, right, Jill? Like really looking
and I
at
don't
that.
want to diminish the success of working with partners, because we lost a lot of that over the years, and now building it back up is important.
Right.
And the ones we never had, so.
Yeah, exactly. But yeah, so still, that's really hard. Anybody else? Yeah.
Can I squeeze another one in?
Sure.
So it appears that your structure is really focused on connecting universities and agencies, correct? I mean.
Yeah, we're trying to leverage the the scientific expertise
and a variety
and
of stakeholders.
yeah.
Do you happen to have any examples of cases where the plans that were developed resulted in modifications to oil and gas pads for plover or deer, or something where there's been modification to a shoreline or a marsh, or something like that? So where you've worked with private industry that was going to come in and do one thing, and everybody's like, whoa, wait, we got this great plan.
Yeah.
No judgment.
No. Thank you. No, I would say, I think I'm going to broadly say no. We could probably squeeze out one example, but our reach, we have had to be, especially in the past administration, had to be pretty focused on who we could work with, DOI partners in the states and things like that, and really stick to management of fish, wildlife, and their habitats, which, yes, you gave a good example of, shoreline. We could certainly be helping develop proposal or plans around nature-based solutions for shoring up shorelines, for example. But I can't think necessarily of a specific example at the moment where like we've really made a difference to, if there was going to be development and we said, no, this is the better option. That's a great question. I should go find out if we've done that somewhere along the line.
I was just wondering.
Yeah.
So,
I mean, we've had examples of projects where the science and the co-production, framing the problem and thinking about the decision-making is led up, thinking of some barrier islands in the Gulf of Mexico, where they've had impacts on decisions about shipping channel, dredging, and the impact of that on, longshore sediment transport, and what those impacts would be to, nesting plovers or the, dune structure, enabling those barrier islands to protect coastal infrastructure, coastal resources, in Mississippi. And so, that information has gone directly into how they have evaluated the impact of increased storms and the decisions about dune restoration and other and shipping channels and other sort of industry related policies.
Yeah, and then I just remember that one project I showed that was working with the Nisqually Indian tribe, that has implications in Washington for Interstate 5, and I don't remember off the top of my head what those are, but there's something about what our partners there are producing that will affect sort of highway overpass or something, so an infrastructure. And then we also have some projects, now I'm thinking of a few, where they have looked at culverts and that restriction on salmon passage. So we do have some that have, I guess, affected a little bit more in terms of infrastructure decisions. Yeah.
Well, thank you.
Sure. Thank you. I'm sorry to keep you all long. Thank you so much for staying.